All right, well, good morning, First Marion.
Good morning.
My name is Knieriem, and I know a bunch of you here. Not everybody, but I've been in ministry in Jackson County for over 20 years. So no long introductions today. Let's just get going. I'm going to make a statement today. And all I want you to do, church, is if you agree with this statement, just give me an amen. Sound cool? All right, here's the statement. This world that we're living in today has lost its mind. Amen. Amen. Yeah, I mean, the world now tells us that boys can be girls, that girls can be boys. It tells us that men can get pregnant. This world will tell you that my GMC in the parking lot is a greater threat to humanity than China pointing nukes at everybody. I just found out the other day that mathematics is racist. And did you know there are schools in the United States, no joke, there are schools in the United States of America that are installing litter boxes in their bathrooms so that kids who identify as cats have a place to go. This is insanity. This is crazy. We're not celebrating diversity here in America. We're celebrating mental illness. And now, the very same people, church, that are presuming to instruct us on all these other things, now want to tell the church how it needs to operate. If there's any pastors in the room, they want to tell us who we have to join in marriage. Church members, First Marion, they want to tell you who you have to admit into your church membership. And the worst part about this is, guys, the people, the very people that want to instruct the church don't go to church. So, First Marion, when the world comes knocking, what do? We're going to answer that this morning. Let me tell you a story about myself first. When I was probably 13 or 14 years old, and young men, AJ, you start to feel like you're kind of a man, right? I wanted to be a man. My dad, he was a man's man. I wanted to do all the things that he did. And my dad, he knew I wasn't really ready for all of that. One of my favorite things to do was drive the tractor. But Dad, he didn't like me getting on the tractor when he wasn't around. But I did a lot of deer hunting, and I remember all those years ago, just becoming a teenager, there was a field on our property, and it was right next to a natural gas pipeline right away. And that field hadn't been mowed in years, and I wanted to hunt that field, so I decided I would wait until Mom and Dad went to work one summer morning, and I would cut this field with the bush hog. So I remember that morning waking up, I waited till I heard them long gone, and I got on that tractor and hooked up the bush hog, and I went down to this field. And when I got there, this thing was tall. I mean, this wasn't just weeds. This was little saplings. It was tall. But it was fun for me because I had a philosophy. If the tractor could bend it over, I thought the bush hog ought to cut it, Hey, I know exactly what a Coleman cooler sounds like coming out the back of a bush hog, I know what that sounds like. I was having a good time. I mean, driving the tractor was fun to me. Everything was going great until something happened. I ran over a little hole in the ground, about this big, not very big. I ran over a little hole in the ground, and when the bush hog cleared that hole, out from the ground came some creatures that up to that point in my life, I had never paid any attention to. Anybody know what they were? Yellow jackets, thank you. When those yellow jackets came out of that hole, they had a singular purpose, and that was to sting the kid on the tractor. I got stung in the back, I got stung in the arm, I got stung on the forehead. I jumped off that tractor, I took off running across the field. They chased me. I see on the side of the field, I see a piece of metal siding like you'd see on a pole barn. I grabbed that siding and I pulled it over top of me. And when I pulled that siding over top of me, you could hear them ping, 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 hitting that siding trying to get to me. And when I came out from under that siding, after about a minute or so, they finally let up on me. When I came out from under that piece of siding, I had a new mission in life. Destroy the yellow jackets. I started walking back towards the tractor, but when I looked at the tractor, they were still buzzing around. They were trying to sting the tires on this thing. So I walked all the way back to our house. And when I got up to the house, I did not walk in the front door. I went straight to the garage because I was looking for some kind of a weapon to combat these little bees. And it occurred to me when I got in the garage, I didn't know what to do. But fortunately for me, growing up out in the country about 30 or 40 years ago, there was a place where young men could go and gain knowledge on almost any topic imaginable. That place was called the General Store. And in Mount Pleasant, Indiana, my grandma and grandpa owned the store. It was called Flamion's General Store. And on any given day, if you walked into that store, you would see a group of old men sitting in chairs loafing. How many of you know what loafing is? These guys would weigh in on any topic. It didn't matter what it was. They would talk about politics. They would talk about religion. They would talk about logging. They would talk about farming. I think I heard them one time talking about beauty products. You know what I mean? They would weigh in on everything. If they had a business card, it would just say their name, and below it would say expert on everything. You know? So I went to Flamion's General Store that day after being stung all those times. I had red spots on my arm. I had a big bump on my forehead, and I walked in, and there's a group of old men in there, and two of those old men, my grandpa was one of them, sitting there, and his buddy that we called Socks. I don't even think I ever knew Socks' real name. But they're sitting there. My grandpa, he looks at me, and he says, "What in the world happened to you?" And I said, "Well, Papa," said, "I was bush hogging the field down by the pipeline." And that's the only words I got out of my mouth. And Socks, he leans over and he laughs. He goes, "Yellow jackets." And I said, "Yeah." I said, I got stung by a bunch of yellow jackets. And then my grandpa leaned forward and he goes, "Bet you want to know how to get rid of them, don't you?" I thought, man, I've come to the right place. I said, "Yeah, what do I do?" And he said, "I'll tell you what you do." But he said that, and another guy across the room said, "Oh, you can't get rid of yellow jackets." And my grandpa said, "Hush." He said, "Don't listen to him, Aaron." He said, "He's got no skin in the game." He said, "Here's what you do." He said, "Wait till the sun gets down low in the sky." He said, "You watch that hole." He said, "Once the sun goes down," he said, "those bees will come out of the sky and they will go back down into that hole." He said, "Once all the bees are down in the hole," he said, "grab you a can of gas." He said, "Pour some gas down in the hole." He said, "Light a match and all your problems will go away." And Socks is just sitting there going, "Yep, yep." I was excited about this idea. I think I was more excited than I should have been. And ladies in the room, tell me if this is true. I think I was more excited than I should have been because all men are pyros. I mean, we love fire. We like burning things. So I was really pumped about it. I went home. I waited for the sun to get low in the sky, and I went out to the garage, and I grabbed my dad's gas can. And we lived way out in the country, so we didn't just have a 5-gallon gas can. We had a 6-gallon gas can, and it was full. So I grabbed that gas can, and I grabbed one of my dad's lighters, and I took off down to that pipeline. And when I got down there, I waited by that piece of metal siding, and I watched that hole, and sure enough, as the sun went down, I watched those bees like ribbons in the sky coming down out of there and going into that hole. After about 15 or 20 minutes, there was no activity. I knew they were all in the hole, so I snuck over to the hole. And when I got there, I could hear them buzzing in the ground. So I hurried and I grabbed that can and I poured a bunch of gas down the hole. And then I jumped back. Nothing happened. But I could still hear them buzzing down in the hole. So in my mind, I've worked it out that there must be this intricate system of tunnels down there full of these bees. So naturally, I thought, I need to put more gas in this hole. So I took the can, I poured all 6 gallons of gas down the hole. I stepped back and I put the gas can down. And as I was putting the gas can down, I could have swore I heard more bees in there. I thought, I cannot believe these things have not been drowned out. And when I started to look back towards the hole, I looked at the back of the tractor, and on the back of my dad's tractor, he had a chainsaw gas can there. One of those good ones. You guys remember the metal ones that were round and they had the yellow spout? He had one of those on there, and I thought, I wonder if there's any gas in that. So I walked over there, it's got a bunch of gas in it, And so I thought, I'm going to pour this gas in, because anything worth doing is worth doing right, So I go over there with that gas can, I pour it down in there. Now, church, I've got 8 to 8.5 gallons of gas down this hole at this point. So I reached in my pocket and grabbed the lighter, because I'm ready for all my problems to go away, What happened next? It looked like something out of an action movie. It looked like something out of Die Hard, you know what I mean? All I did was I bent down to that hole and I flicked the lighter. I'm pretty sure the lighter never even lit. But in front of me, I saw a flash. I could have swore the hole bulged, the ground bulged out, and within a millisecond, there was fire 30 feet in the air, all around me in every direction. I started screaming, I'm going to die, and I start rolling around on the ground. There was a car driving by on the road 200 yards away. They thought the pipeline had ruptured, all right? This explosion was so big. But as quick as all that fire went around me, it was gone, along with the yellow jackets. And both my eyebrows, and all the hair on the front of my head. All of it was gone. Next morning, I went back to Flaming's General Store. There's Papaw, and there's Socks when I walked in. My grandpa, he looked up. I'm standing in front of him with no eyebrows and no hair on the front of my head. He said, "What in the world happened to you?" I said, "Well, Papaw, I did exactly what you told me to do." And that's all I said. And then Socks leans over again and he laughs. He goes, "Too much gas." They never said how much gas to pour down the hole, And my grandpa said, he said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "Let me tell you what you need to do different next time." And I said, "Hold on a second." I said, "Wait a minute." Socks is sitting there going, yep. I said, "Wait a minute. So let me ask you guys a question." I said, "How many times have you done it?" You know what they said? "We've never done it." We just wait for morons like you to walk in here so we can tell you how to do it, You know what I've discovered, church? Everybody wants to tell you how to do it, but they've never done it. First Marion, they want you to follow their advice, and they want you to listen to their counsel, but they've got no skin in the game. So when the world comes knocking, and they're coming, I promise you, what do? Truth is, we do what almost nobody does anymore. We stick to what is written in the book. This world is going to throw all kinds of things at you. And my prayer for you, church, I know you're looking for a pastor, so pastors can bring all sorts of ideas into congregations. My prayer for you, First Marion, is that you will be a church that sticks to what is written in the book. Speaking of what's written in the book, this morning I want to take your attention to the life of a man that we preachers, we do not preach on very often. He's a man whose name has gone down throughout history. It's been in infamy all throughout history. He's the man who betrayed the very Son of God. His name is Judas. I know probably some of you are thinking, Judas, what could we possibly learn from the life of Judas? I promise you, church, if you will listen this morning, there's an important lesson that we can all learn from Judas Iscariot. We're going to do it different than we normally do, though, today. I'm going to tell you the lesson first. I'm going to begin backwards. I'm going to tell you what the lesson is first, and then we're going to read it. Judas had been with the disciples for 3.5 years. Everywhere that they went, he went. He had an incredible act. The disciples in 3.5 years never once suspected that he wasn't real. He fooled everybody. His act was so convincing, he fooled everyone. Everyone except for the Son of God. You know what the lesson is? Church, if we're not careful, our lives can become a powerful act. We can pretend to be more than we are. We can pretend to be something that we're not. And after hundreds, if not thousands of Sundays in church throughout our life, one day we look in the mirror and we're faced with a terrifying question. Am I real? Or are parts of my life just a good act? Now your act, church, it could fool me and it may fool your pastor whenever he comes along. But nobody's act ever fools God. God didn't call us to be great actors or actresses. But sadly, guys, many of the greatest acts that you will ever see are not on some Broadway stage or they're not on some movie set in Hollywood. Many of the greatest acts that you will ever see are in churches. God didn't call us to be great actors and actresses. So my question to you this morning is just this. Are you real? There's good news too. The good news is, guys, God lays out benchmarks in the Bible that can tell us that we are. I just want to cover 4 of those this morning. Turn in your Bibles, if you've got them, to the book of Mark, chapter 14, starting in verse 17. This is the Last Supper. Jesus he's letting the disciples know that bad things are coming his way and that it's going to be tough on them. And in this passage, he names his betrayer. Read with me. In the evening, he, that's Jesus, came with the 12. Now as they sat and ate, Jesus said, "Assuredly, I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." And they began to be sorrowful and to say one by one, listen to what they said, "Is it I?" And then another one said, "Is it I?" I'm crying out inside, guys, it's Judas. Not one of the disciples suspected that it was him. As a matter of fact, when Jesus said, "One of you is going to betray me," they didn't look down the table and say, "Is it him? Is it him?" They said, "Is it me? Am I the one that's going to betray the Savior?" Peter, Mark, Luke, it's Judas. Can you not see that? I can hear him now. If we could go back there with them right now, they would be telling us this. They would say, "Wait a minute, Aaron, hold on a second. Judas has been with us for 3.5 years. When Jesus fed 5,000 people, he was there. He helped us pick up the extra bread and put it in the baskets. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Judas was there. When Jesus walked on water, he was in the boat. You're telling me that he wasn't real? He was just an accomplished act. How many of you right now, just be honest with me, how many of you right now are thinking, how could Judas see all the things he saw and spend all those years with Jesus and not be real and not submit to Jesus as Lord? How could he not? The Bible's pretty clear on this one, guys. Not everybody will. James 2:19 says this, "You believe that there is one God, good, but even the demons believe that, and they shudder." Not everybody will submit to Jesus as Lord. Here's your first benchmark this morning. Real Christians don't just acknowledge his existence. They submit to him as Lord. What about the other disciples? Were they real? If you guys want to know if the other disciples were real, you don't have to read a whole lot in the Bible other than to know this. You just need to know the ways that they died. If you look at the ways the disciples died, you know that they were real. I mean, they were tortured, stoned, beheaded, crucified upside down. And the Bible even says that many of them, while they were going to these torturous deaths, were singing songs of praise to God. They were real. I'll tell you this, church. These disciples didn't have to die. They could have lived. All they had to do was stay quiet. All they had to do was stop preaching this offensive message of Christ being crucified and rising from the dead. All they had to do was stop preaching that. All they had to do, church, was let everybody go to hell. And they could have lived. But he was their Lord. They couldn't stop. They knew that if they stopped preaching, the very rocks would cry out. I think this is relevant to us. It's relevant to all churches today. Don't get me wrong, preachers are more than happy to celebrate Christ. But nowadays, we're more than happy to celebrate Christ so long as we don't upset somebody while we're doing it. So long as we don't offend somebody. We're happy to celebrate Christ, but now we don't just worry about people going to hell. We're worried about things like attendance and offerings and Google reviews, YouTube likes. So what do, pastors? We water down the gospel to make it less offensive to everybody. And you know what, pastors? Preachers across the nation, they're loved for doing this. They're not in danger. They're loved for watering down the gospel. You know what the problem with preachers is today? Nobody wants to kill us anymore. Why would they? The disciples were real, and it cost them their lives. Church, what does your Christianity ever really cost you? Real Christians submit to Jesus Christ as Lord, no matter what the cost. How many of you this morning don't want to be an act? Raise your hand if you don't want to be an act. I don't want to be one either, but I'm going to level with you. There are people in churches all across the United States that show up on Sunday, but they're just not real. I've been a children's pastor for over 20 years now. I'm telling you this. How many of you have kids or grandkids? Raise your hand. How many of you know that they're God's little narcs? Oh, they are. I've been a children's pastor for over 20 years. I know where all the bodies are buried. They listen to you. They watch you, everything that you're doing and saying, and then they come to church and they spill it. I'm telling you. I know all about it. I have a little nephew, Lane. I'm going to tell you that story, I think. My little nephew, Lane, he's not little anymore. He's this big. He's in his 20s now. But I remember when he was 6 years old, my brother and his wife, they needed somebody to watch him for a summer. And my dad, he was retired. He said, I'll watch him, just bring him over the house. So he stayed with my dad for a summer, and they did all sorts of things together. But one of the things they used to do was they used to walk out onto the driveway, and our house was on a hill. And they would look down that hill, and down that hill was a gravel road that went by our home. And my dad was not always pleased with the speed at which everybody drove on that gravel road. You know what I mean? So they would watch these cars go through on that gravel road. Well, after that summer, we had a family gathering down at Mom and Dad's. I went down there, and I did the same thing that they would do. I walked out on the driveway, and I was just looking down there at that gravel road, and here comes little Lane. He comes running out there to stand by me, and we're watching that road, and a car comes through. And it's not going fast. And little Lane, I look down at him, and he starts shaking his head, and he looks up at me, and he goes, "Idiots." I knew that was my dad talking. I knew that was my... But the kids are always watching. They're always paying attention to you, even when you don't want them to. But you know what scares me, church? In rock-solid, Bible-believing churches, we are losing 70% of our kids once they reach adulthood. And I'm not talking about they're leaving and going to another church. They're leaving the faith. I've been in children's ministry for 20-some years now. That means that the kids that I had when I first started are now adults, many of them with kids of their own. And over the years, I've seen many of them out, and we're always glad to catch up. And they're like, "Aaron, how's it going? Hey, good to see you." We catch up for a little bit, and I always ask the same question. I say, "Hey, where are you going to church now?" You know what over half of them tell me? We don't go to church anymore. I'm blown away by that. I said, "Wait, you don't go to church? You were so on fire for God when you were a kid. Every time we opened the doors to the church, you were there. Every time I ask a question in Sunday school, you had your hand up." You know what they tell me? In one way or another, almost every one of them, it boils down to this. They all say something like this. They say, "Well, Aaron, you don't understand. We went to church and we felt the love. But then we went home. And what was at church wasn't at home." Pretty soon little kids become big kids. And they decide that church is just an act. And eventually they get tired of the act. I'm saying that to say this, church. If you're going to be real somewhere, be real at home. kids are watching. Benchmark number 2 this morning is James 4:10. You don't have to turn to it. It's one simple line, but it's very powerful. James 4:10 says this, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. Best way the Bible teaches you to humble yourself in God's sight is just this. Be aware of your sin. I think a lot of us here are really good at being aware of sin. I think the problem is we're really good at being aware of everybody else's sin. You know what I mean? The Bible says be aware of yours. Real Christians, they're aware of their sin, and it breaks their heart. I think this one's hard for us, me included. I think it's hard for us, church, because we're the good people, aren't we? I mean, we're not out stealing. We're not getting drunk. We're not doing drugs. We're the good people. We're not doing all those foul things. That's those people. And aren't we glad, church, that we're not like those people? Real Christians are aware. I think just about everybody here is mature enough to know that they need Christ. But I believe that there are people here today, as they are in every church, that know that they need Christ, but they don't think they need Christ as much as those people. I promise you, if you believe that, church, you are wrong. Through the eyes, it says, James 4:10 says, humble yourselves in God's sight. Through the eyes of a holy and perfect God, a God who has never lied, never cheated, never stolen, never even had a bad thought. Through those eyes, the truth is, guys, there's not a lot of difference between all of us down here. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm up here on stage. I'm higher than all of you, right? Does that mean that I'm closer to the sun? Maybe so. But the truth is, the distance is so great between all of us and the sun, it doesn't matter, does it? Guys, through the eyes of a holy and perfect God, there's not a lot of difference between an Aaron Knieriem and an Adolf Hitler. Real Christians, when you're real, you are humbled by your sin. And it points you towards Christ. Third benchmark, just two more, guys, just two more, is in 1 John 2, verses 4 through 6. And for time's sake, just let me read that to you. It says, whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Listen to what it says here. It says, whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. We ought to, right? But the Bible also says we're all commandment breakers. So how do we know that we abide in him? We ought to walk in the way that he walked. When I was a little boy, I remember one of my favorite things to do was go rabbit hunting with Dad. That happened in January, and the ground was always soggy. My dad, he'd grab a shotgun. He'd say, come on, we're going rabbit hunting. I would grab a BB gun. I wasn't going to kill anything, okay? I didn't know that, but I thought I was hunting. But most of the time, I was just kind of bored playing around out there, so I just would walk behind my dad through the field. And my dad, he was much bigger than me. He had a big foot, and he made a big footprint. He had a long stride, and he had a long stride. So what I would do when I was following my dad with that little BB gun is I would try and step in his footprints. So if you watched me walking out there, you would watch me trying to step in his footprints. And the ground was soggy and wet, and I stretched myself farther than I could stretch many times. And there were times that I slid, there were times that I stumbled, and many times I even fell while I was trying to walk like him. If you were able to go back in time, and if you were able to stand on the edge of that field and watch that little boy and his dad, you would say, man, that little boy, look at him. He stumbles, he slides, he even falls sometimes. That boy even looks like a fool doing it. But if you were able to go back in time and see that, you would also have to come to one conclusion. That the greatest desire of that little boy's heart was to walk like that man. How do you know if you abide in him? Church, you will stumble. You will slide, and sometimes you will even fall. But through all of that is the greatest desire of your heart to walk like that man. One more benchmark and we're out of here. This one is in Mark, all right? Mark 7. Mark 7 starting in verse 35. You have to understand leading up to this, things were not going well. Jesus had just learned that John the Baptist had been beheaded. He had basically been run out of his hometown. The Pharisees, they were trying to trip him up at every turn. And God's chosen people were still living in poverty under Roman rule. Things were not going well, and in the midst of all of that, some folks from Galilee brought to Jesus a man who was deaf and mute. And Jesus healed him there on the spot. And this is what it says about that. It says, immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one. But the more he commanded them, the more they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure. Hear this, church. They were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. Christians, do you believe that? I was a hospice chaplain. Me and John Pierce, we were hospice chaplains, if you know John. And that just means that I visited folks who were nearing the end of their life as a pastor. And it was a blessing to me, but I remember a lady that I met in Bedford. She was remarkable. She was in her 80s at this point. And she told me about her life, and she was a lifelong church member. She was a volunteer in the church. She was a volunteer in the community. She worked at a food pantry that was there. And she walked everywhere. For 20 years, she didn't have a driver's license. She told me stories about walking across town 3 miles in winter to make sure somebody got communion. She took food to people. She volunteered for every single event at the church. She was amazing. But now she was dying. When I met her, she was laying on a hospital bed in the middle of her living room. And she told me about this, and she was chipper. She was happy, but she had stage 4 cancer, and it had eaten her body up, all inside. And after we had talked for a little bit, she wanted her Bible. It was on a coffee table right behind me. And all she did, church, all she did was raised her arm this far and pointed. And when she did that, something happened inside her, and she screamed out in pain. And she started crying. She couldn't control it. She said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. She started crying. And I'm holding her hand. And guys, I had to look away. And I remember thinking in that moment, God, she's given so much to you. This lady has volunteered. She's done so many things in her life. She's given so much of herself to you. Can you not just give her some peace and some comfort as she's coming down the home stretch? Finally, I composed myself, and I turned and looked back at her. And when I turned and looked back at her, she wasn't crying anymore. She looked angry. She was mad at me. And I said, hey, you okay? She squeezed my hand. And she said something that I will not forget as long as I live. She shook her head and she said, son, don't you think that? Don't you think that? And I did what I always do. I put on the act. And I said, don't think what? And she let go of my hand. And she looked up at the ceiling, and in intense pain, she raised that finger again. And it shook, and she said, son, he's doing all things well. Church, she was real. This world has lost its mind. And it's going to come and it's going to tell you what you need to be, First Marion. But here's what I'm telling you. I've said all that this morning just to say this. If you're going to be anything in your Christian walk from here forward, be real. Pray with me. God, thank you for this church and these folks. I'm blessed that you've given me the opportunity to be here, and I'm thankful for your word. And Lord, I just pray that we would be changed, that we would not leave here the same as we came. God, thank you again for giving us Jesus, for doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. We praise your holy name. Amen.